All right, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Goodwin. My call is VE3KG. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Officer for the Radio Amateurs of Canada. I'm part of a team that are the principal interlocutors with our regulator, the Department of Industry, Science and Economic Development. So today I'll be presenting to you on RAC's regulatory accomplishments and our initiatives. So my agenda for this presentation is I'm going to start off with myself. I'll be talking about some of our priorities and some of the actions that we've taken in recent months. Following me, Brian Rawlings, V3QN, will be presenting on a very important piece of news, the update to RBR4. That's an essential regulatory document that sets the parameters for the activities we can do as radio amateurs. Finally, the third part of this presentation will be by Richard Birch, V3KI. Richard will be presenting on some of RAC's proposals for the amateur radio satellite service in Canada. The final part of this presentation will be with you. Hopefully, if you have any questions, comments, anything you'd like to share, hopefully we'll be able to raise that in the Q&A session. If you have particular questions, I hope that Brian, Richard, or I will be able to answer them for you. So I'll start off with a little bit of history. Back in September of 2019, RAC held its biannual planning meeting in Moncton, New Brunswick. At the planning meeting, we established a pecking order for what our regulatory priorities were, what particular projects we wanted to pursue with ISED. The first of these is we were looking to have ISED update RBR4 to give us the 2 new amateur bands. We'll be hearing more about that from Brian very shortly. The second order of priority was to seek an update to call sign policy. What we were going to do is come up with a series of recommendations to ISED for how we might change the current policy on amateur radio call signs. The third order of priority was a proposal for a new entry-level certificate in amateur radio, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And the fourth priority was established as trying to work out a means, the correct means by which we can engage ISED on enforcement issues on those occasions when they're required. Now, these are the 4 priorities. There are other ongoing issues that we always have to tend to, and the most important of these are the preparations for every World Radio Conference. The next World Radio Conference will be in 2023, and we'll have a separate presentation on WRC 23 preparations in the next hour. So, the first project I'd like to talk about in some detail is our current survey on call sign policy. Now, call sign policy for amateur radio was established in an ISED document called RIC9. This document has been in force since about 2005 and has not really seen serious change in some significant time. We're now conducting a survey seeking your opinions, seeking the opinions of Canadian radio amateurs on what changes we should make to RIC9. So the survey has been up since early August. It will end on the 30th of September. We've received about 2,000 responses so far, which is a very gratifying response, but we're looking for more. So please, if you haven't already, please go to the RAC website, find the survey, complete the survey, and let us know what you think on some of these issues. The survey looks at all aspects of the current policy. What I did is I sat down with RIC9, I'm the author of the survey, sat down with RIC9 and went clause by clause through the entire document, trying to pick out the issues that are reflected in that document, and to turn around and pose questions to radio amateurs how they feel about these various issues. So there are some hints at where some of the possible directions we may go. We may ask ISED to open up new blocks of prefixes, new call sign prefixes for radio amateurs. We also may ask ISED to look at new call sign formats. We're asking questions about Canadian amateurs' interests in having our current system of call areas. Many radio amateurs have a strong affection for the way in which you can tell an amateur's province or territory by the prefix of the call sign. How popular is that really? How I'd like to know. I'm very keen to find out how important Canadian radio amateurs feel that is. One of the ongoing problems is with the renewability of call signs. Right now, when a call sign is assigned to you, it's assigned to you until your 125th birthday, unless you give up the call sign or unless ISED is authoritatively informed of your passing. So what I call the 125-year rule has created a situation where there are call signs that are held by amateurs who have long since who are long since deceased, and that has created a situation where there is the shortage of call signs, especially two-letter call signs in some provinces. So, could there be a renewal process? How open would amateurs be to having some form of renewing the registration of a call sign? At the end of the survey, we will make the raw data of the survey available on the RAC website, so you can go in there, take a look at it, and interpret the data and parse the data any way you wish. But the data will be used to help inform proposals that RAC will make to ISED for change in this policy. Now, I will probably be the principal author of whatever proposals we come up with, but I will be consulting widely amongst Canadian amateurs about what our proposals will be. What will happen is I will draft proposals. The board of RAC will decide which of those proposals become the policy of RAC and forward those proposals to ISED. ISED will be the ones to decide which, if any, of these proposals they will implement. So we've already seen some indication from ISED that they are open to making change, and they show a great interest in trying to provide better service to radio amateurs. And hopefully we can come up with a set of policies that they can implement, and that will be satisfying to most Canadian amateurs. The proposed entry-level certificate, it was an idea first conceived by Quebec Director Guy Richard, VE2XTD. Guy proposed this several years ago. It was adopted by the RAC board in 2019. It was actually presented to ISED at the Canadian Amateur Radio Advisory Board meeting in April of 2022. You can find details of the proposal in a YouTube video. You can probably find a link to the RAC website. I've provided you a link right there. You'll also find some mention of the proposal in TCA at various times. ISED has assigned an officer to discuss the way forward with Guy. One of the things I'd like to caution you that regulations change in this country is sometimes very slow and very difficult. There are significant regulatory issues associated with creating a new class of amateur radio certificate. So this is not something that's going to happen quickly. It will take a long time, perhaps years, before this really comes to the fore. However, there has to be a starting point, and that starting point is now. So there is a possibility at some time in the future that we will have a new entry-level certificate for as a learner's permit entry into amateur radio in Canada. One of the ongoing issues is finding the right way of engaging ISED on enforcement issues. There are occasions when radio amateurs need to engage ISED on enforcement matters. For the most part, we're pretty good at policing ourselves, or most part, we're very good at being good citizens in the RF spectrum. However, there are occasions, rare occasions, when we need to engage ISED. And collecting information in a way that is actually useful to ISED is a challenge. ISED is an enforcement agency in some respects of its mandate, and it has to be able to collect information to an appropriate standard. So if radio amateurs are going to be providing information to ISED, it has to be able to meet a standard that ISED can actually use. There have been occasions when radio amateurs have become upset about a particular situation that may be happening, perhaps the misbehavior of an individual radio amateur, more often be some kind of interference by non-amateur signals. And there has been a tendency for amateurs to contact ISED and lead with emotion. And it isn't necessarily a constructive way to go. It'd be better off if we could collect information in a disciplined fashion to a standard that ISED can use to perhaps open an investigation and to consider whether or not there is actually something enforceable in the complaint. So in aid of coming up with best practices to help radio amateurs engage ISED constructively, we have a small working group of 2 RAC members, our Vice President, Alan Boyd, VE3AJB, and Patrick Kierans, VE3KPA. They are going to be meeting with an ISED officer who is engaged in their enforcement responsibilities to come up with the best practices that radio amateurs can use when they need to engage ISED on enforcement issues. Al Boyd is a retired officer of the Ontario Provincial Police, and so has a great breadth of experience in criminal procedure, in collection of evidence, in understanding the nature of an enforcement investigation. As well, Patrick Hirons, V3KPA, is a retired barrister, a lawyer with a great deal of experience of the law. Patrick has even presented cases at the Supreme Court of Canada, so he comes to us with a tremendous amount of skill and ability. So these two people are probably the ideal people to have working on this matter, because they will be able to come up with processes that make sense and that could guide the actions of individual radio amateurs on those rare occasions when we need to engage ISED. Other projects on the go. Of course, you may all be familiar with the basic and advanced question banks. These are the question banks that are used to inform the examinations that we give to new radio amateurs and those who are acquiring new skills. In the basic question bank, there are well over 1,000 questions in 100 different topic areas. In the advanced question bank, there are over 500 questions in 50 different topic areas. In each of these topic areas, there are approximately 11 questions available. There are some problems with the questions in both banks. Some of the questions are out of date. Some of the questions have incorrect information or dubious information in them. Some of the questions are irrelevant to amateur radio, and some of the questions are just badly written. So these are things that need to be corrected. And what RAC has proposed is to provide ISED with recommendations on a regular basis, on a planned basis, provide recommendations for changes to update the question banks. ISED has undertaken to provide a single point of contact, a single staffer who will be responsible for receiving these suggestions and taking action. RAC is in the process of establishing a new examination standards committee. The committee has now terms of reference approved by the RAC board. I've begun the process of recruiting people to serve on this committee, and we found people from coast to coast so far. I'm hoping to have a very good collection of people from right across the country. What I'm really looking for are people who are RAC members, who are accredited examiners, or instructors in basic or advanced courses. I believe these are the people who are going to be ideally suited to point out the particular questions in the question bank that need attention and to recommend appropriate remedies. So this is a large task, and my vision for this is that every 2 years, RAC will be providing a regular set of recommendations for updates to either the advanced or the basic question bank, so that every 4 years we have a renewed, refreshed question bank. I hope we can do this on a regularized basis. This is a large job, and it will require a lot of work by a lot of individuals to make this work properly. Also, of rising concern are electromagnetic compatibility problems. The recommendation of a RAC member, RAC is developing reviving our old electromagnetic compatibility committee, and we want people with good technical qualifications and experience to be able to make recommendations on behalf of RAC for changes to ISED documents concerning equipment. There are ISED standards for equipment that could potentially cause interference and that could receive interference. So what we need are recommendations from RAC representing the interests of Canadian amateurs to make changes to those ISED documents. And also we need to come up with best practices for amateurs to deal with EMC issues. So right now it's a very small group of 3 people who are still working out the details of the terms of reference for the committee, but this is the general thrust of what that committee will do. So the next order on the agenda is the update to RBR4, a very important regulatory document. So I'd now like to turn it over to Brian Rawlings, V3QN, who can describe not only what's happened with the update to RBR4, but also the history of how we got there. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Brian Rawlings, VE3QN, and it's been my honor for the last 12 years, I guess it has been, to represent RAC with our regulator, ISED, and their previous name, of course, Industry Canada, on issues affecting amateur radio at World Radio Communication conferences. And I've just recently gone into a semi-retirement from that function. Paul Coverdale is going to be doing that from this point on. But I would like to talk to you about an event that occurred at the end of July when ISED issued a new issue of RBR4. And we're going to take a couple of minutes to talk about what that meant, and maybe also, because it's very relevant, why it took so long. So, what's the big deal with RBR4? Well, it's the authorizing document to use amateur radio frequencies. And it's needed because Canadian radio amateurs are technically no longer individually licensed. Some of us who have been licensed, there I just said it, for a long time actually did get licenses. I've had an amateur radio license for 62 years, so I can remember when we paid $30 a year, and that renewed our license. But ISED, or the regulator, changed that in 2000, so we're not technically licensed any longer, and that means that we cannot use the allocations appearing in the Canadian Table of Frequency Allocations unless they also appear in the current issue of RBR4. Now, while ISED completed the consultations on changes to the Canadian Table of Frequency Allocations following the 2012 and 2015 conferences, RBR4 had not been updated until the issue that was released in July. So we have been living under an issue just issued in January 2014. And now we have an issue that came out in July of 2022. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that are in the new issue and why they're there and what they do. First of all, included in the update, probably the most important part of the reissue, is the authority to use two new amateur radio bands. They're new to us. They may not be new to some people in other countries who've been able to use them, in some cases for several years. But we are now legally allowed to use the 630 meter band, which was approved at the 2012 WRC. Just going to take a moment to mention that these pictures are not here just to pretty up the presentation, but I am showing some of the people who made it happen. On the picture on the left, you can see Lisa Amaro on the left, who works for ISED, Oli Garpstead, who's the vice president of the Amateur Radio Union, and Justine Sider of ISED. And Lisa and Justine were significant players in ensuring that we were able to get the amateur radio allocation at 630 meters. The other new band, of course, was a segment in the 60 meter band, which was approved at the 2015 WRC. And in the picture you see on the right, we have myself, Christine Shu, who worked for ISED and who chaired the Canadian delegation through the preparatory conferences, and did a great deal to make that possible, to make the allocation possible. And on the right, we see Flavio Arcangelo, PY2ZX from the Brazilian delegation, but who worked actively and carefully with us, especially with respect to amateurs in Latin America, to get the allocation in 60 meters. So, a couple of things about these two new bands. 472 to 479 kilohertz. It's a band that's 7 kilohertz wide. We call it the 630 meter band. Represents a return to the medium waves after, I say, 200 meters and down. But that was the decision that was taken in the very, very early days of radio to ban radio experimenters, radio amateurs, if you want, from all frequencies below 1500 kilohertz. So 472 to 479 marks the return to that portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's a rather daunting power limit to this band, 5 watts EIRP, but that, I'll comment again in a moment, that may not be as limiting as some of you think. Then there's the new 60-meter segment. It extends from 5351.5 to 5366.5 kilohertz. It's a 15 kilohertz wide segment in the 60-meter band. It represents the first new ITU authorized HF spectrum since the frequencies that we obtained at WARC 79. And it's in addition, for us as Canadians, to the 5 spot frequencies that we've enjoyed since 2014. I didn't mention the fifth, I should say, is not counted because actually the new segment covers 5358.5, which has been one of the spot frequencies. The authorized power is 100 watts effective radiated power, and that's the same as for the spot frequencies. And it's an exception granted by ISED to Canadian amateurs. I'll say a little bit more in a moment about that, but most amateurs in other parts of the world are limited to 15 watts EIRP. Few thoughts on the new 630 meter band. It's a secondary allocation. It means that the primary user, who are the Maritime Mobile Service, are primary. Now, in terms of getting the allocation, there was a whole collection of countries that were opposed to the amateur allocation. Russia certainly was opposed to it. They only agreed when a power limitation of 1 watt EIRP was specified within 800 kilometers of their borders, otherwise 5 watts. Most of Canada, almost all of the parts of Canada that are populated and have radio amateurs are able to use 5 watts, but anywhere that's within 800 kilometers of the Russian border is limited to 1 watt EIRP. Now, to have 5 watts of EIRP, it has been estimated that you would require 150 watts or more into the type of antenna most Canadian amateurs would be able to erect at 630 meters. 630 meters requires some pretty long antennas. A dipole would be about 900 feet long, and a quarter wave vertical would be about 300 meters high. So certainly, most of us would not be able to put antennas of that size, and therefore very inefficient antennas. Few more thoughts. Following a conference at which this allocation was awarded, which was in 2012, ISED, or Industry Canada at the time, held a public consultation on proposed changes to the Canadian Table of Frequency Allocations. At the last minute, there was an objection filed to the proposed amateur allocation. The objection was filed on behalf of the Canadian power utilities, claiming potential interference to their carrier current control systems. These systems operate by sending signals through the high voltage transmission lines, and some of them operate in or near 472 to 479 kilohertz. Now, they're not technically a radio service, and you could argue that they don't really have any rights, but certainly the consequences of interfering with these systems could be quite severe. It took some time to determine that the Canadian systems would not be threatened by the proposed amateur band. And in the end, ISED have spared us, Canadian amateurs, the approval procedures which amateurs in the US are obliged to follow. Some of you may know, but in the US, if an amateur wants to operate in 630 meters, they have to fill out a form or write a letter to an organization that represents US power utilities, stating that they intend to operate and giving their geographic coordinates. And if they don't hear back within 30 days objecting, then they're free to operate. But we don't have to follow even that relatively simple procedure. A few more thoughts, or a few thoughts on the 60-meter segment. Again, it's a secondary allocation. The fixed and mobile services are primary. Our Department of National Defense have significant interests in this part of the spectrum. Also, NATO were opposed to an amateur allocation, many others as well. ISED and RAC were able to secure DND's support for an allocation here. And I have to say, having been at the conference, that both ISED were extremely helpful in terms of making it possible, and the DND was also very accommodating. It was a very difficult negotiation in the conference. And in the end, the compromise was referred to as 15 and 15. That is to say, no more than 15 kilohertz and no more than 15 watts EIRP of power. By the way, our regulator and DND would have been willing had we gotten as much as 50 kilohertz. In the end, not only was the limitation 15 kilohertz, but a very specific and an odd range of frequencies, 5351.5 to 5366.5 kilohertz. And finally, at the International Table of Frequency Allocations issued after WRC 15 stated a power limitation of 15 watts EIRP. Industry Canada conducted a public consultation. RAC, several clubs, and individual amateurs made the case for 100 watts ERP, citing our good experience with this power level on the spot frequencies that we had been authorized in 2014. And ISED honored the amateurs' request and used its prerogative to authorize 100 watts ERP for Canadian amateurs. So how does this sort of thing happen? What's the normal procedure? Well, first of all, member states are at liberty to adopt changes made in the WRC or not. Canada typically will propose changes to the Canadian regulations, and ISED will put these out in a public consultation. RAC, Canadian clubs, individual amateurs have all commented on the public consultations, not only the one I just mentioned, but several before, and it's contributed to favorable outcomes for Canadian amateurs. And after a public consultation, ISED may then update the Canadian regulations and the Canadian Table of Frequency Allocations. Now, why has it taken so long? And why has it taken over 6 years, in fact, 8 years from the time that the last issue of RBR4 came out? Well, first of all, the 630 meter issue at the power utilities took a very long time. It took years for ISED to resolve, partly perhaps not moving as quickly as they could, but mostly because the organization that ISED were dealing with, representing the power utilities, went through a number of organizational changes, and the issue had to be started over with new people on a regular basis. The public consultation on the 60 meter band and consideration of our proposal for an exception to the 15 watt limit also took a little time. But overall, the formalities of drafting new text for RBR4 and processing it through the government's approvals takes a long time and hasn't been helped by the pandemic. RAC had made issuing RBR4 the signature issue on all meetings with ISED over the past several years. And in the last year or so, in particular, as we approached the final issue of it, I would have to single out Phil McBride and Dave for the work that they have done with ISED to finally get the new issue out. And I'd also mention Richard Furch, who actually helped author some of the new document to make sure that we would be happy with it when it finally did come out. So RAC have worked hard with ISED, with CTEL, which is the North American, not North American, but the American collection of administrations, and at the IIRU to obtain these new band segments. As we've seen, there was considerable opposition from many quarters. So let's try to put them to good use. Thank you very much.
Right, so now I'd like to introduce Richard Furch, V3KI, who is going to talk to us about RAC's proposals for regulations for the amateur radio satellite service. Please go ahead, Rich.
I'm talking here about an issue in which we're discussing with the regulator, the topic of how Canadian amateur satellites are regulated. This arose out of discussions we had with the Canadian Space Agency and the regulators on the Canadian CubeSat project, which is a project in which several university teams have been offered the opportunity to design, build CubeSats and have them launched from the International Space Station. These qualify as amateur educational projects to use the amateur satellite service, provided, of course, that all the communications follow the rules for the amateur service. The operators have to be licensed amateurs and so on. It's a complicated approval process involving not only ISED in Canada, but the International Amateur Radio Union, which coordinates frequencies for amateur satellites, and other agencies, other government agencies, and RAC is involved because both ISED and IARU want to know that we're in support of the projects. And the process has uncovered some problems with the rules for Canadian amateur satellites. In particular, there are no rules that were specifically designed for the amateur satellite service. Instead, what we have is regulations that apply to all space services, including amateur satellite service and any others. And of course, these were originally written for commercial or government services. And then we also have a set of regulations for the amateur service, which we should all be familiar with, including RBR4, et cetera. And unfortunately, if you try and comply with both at the same time, there are some things that there's some things that are contradictions. For example, the regulations for the space services call for projects to be licensed. In Canada, the amateur service is exempt from licensing. So this makes the approval process more complicated, and it leads to decisions which both by the project teams and by the regulatory agencies, so on, which may be ad hoc, in which they may discover in future they would have preferred to do in a different way. Are you worried about impacts on Canadian amateurs? Well, if you're a satellite user, no real impact. You go ahead and use satellites. The regulations we're talking about really only apply to the satellite itself and to ground control stations that control the satellite. On the other hand, if you are a member of a team that would like to build and operate a CubeSat, like the one on the right, these are quite small, as you can see, 10 centimeters on a side, then there are complications and uncertainties. There may be even situations where the rules are such that you can't do things the way you expected to. So in response to this, RAC has, of course, raised the issue with the regulator and pointed out some of the particular problem areas and things we think ought to be done to correct the problems. The reason for this is that we want to make sure that potential impediments to any future projects get resolved earlier rather than too late. We don't want to have a team design and build a satellite, get all ready, then go through the approval process and find out that it doesn't get approved because of something they could have prevented if they'd known about it early enough on. And this whole topic then, therefore, is on RAC's list of issues for follow-up with ISED. It's one of the issues on our priority list for CARIB meetings and so on. And that's about all I have to say on it for now.